The moment someone tells you that you're trespassing on your own family's land, you learn exactly how expensive confidence can become. The first thing I noticed that morning wasn't the chain stretched across the gravel road. It was the silence. No cattle moving through the north pasture. No familiar rumble of my old Ford rolling beneath the oak branches my grandfather planted more than 50 years ago. Even the breeze seemed to hesitate before crossing the entrance to our 400-acre farm. Then I saw the security booth. Fresh paint, stone columns, a polished sign carrying the logo of the neighboring HOA like it had always belonged there. Two uniformed guards stepped into the middle of the road before I could reach the gate. One lifted a hand without saying good morning. The other rested a clipboard against his chest like it carried more authority than a county courthouse. "Private community access only," he said. "Turn around." I actually smiled because I thought they had confused me with someone making a delivery. "I'm Ethan Walker," I replied. "My family owns everything beyond this gate." Neither of them moved. The taller guard glanced toward the booth, then back at me with the kind of rehearsed confidence that comes from believing someone else already won the argument. "Sir, we've been instructed not to allow unauthorized individuals onto HOA property." HOA property. Those two words settled over the morning like dust after a tractor passed. I looked beyond the chain and saw my grandfather's weathered red barn standing exactly where it had stood since 1968. The windmill still turned above the well. My father's equipment shed reflected the first rays of sunlight. Every fence line, every pasture, every pond, every inch of it carried my family's fingerprints. Yet here I was, less than 30 feet away, being treated like a stranger. I reached into my truck and pulled out the same brass key that had ridden on my key ring since Dad handed it to me after college. It belonged to the original steel gate that used to stand here long before anyone dreamed of building luxury homes next door. The lock was gone now. So was the gate. In its place stood polished black fencing, decorative landscaping, surveillance cameras, and a keypad that certainly hadn't been installed with my permission. One guard noticed the old key in my hand and laughed quietly. "That won't help you anymore." Maybe he was right. Maybe that key didn't fit the new lock. But keys open more than gates. Sometimes they unlock memories. Sometimes they unlock paperwork people forgot existed. I slowly slid the key back into my pocket and took one last look at the road disappearing between the oak trees. Every tire track on that gravel had once been made by my grandfather's truck, then my father's, then mine. I knew every curve, every drainage ditch, every fence post leaning slightly to the east after decades of Texas storms. What those guards didn't know was something even their HOA president hadn't figured out yet. They thought they were blocking me from my own farm. They never stopped to ask who actually owned the road they were standing on. I sat in my truck for another minute after the guards walked back into their little booth, letting the engine idle while memories filled the silence outside my windshield. That road had never simply been a way to reach the house. It was part of our family's story. My grandfather, Walter Walker, bought the original 160 acres in the spring of 1968 after returning from years of working cattle across West Texas. Over the next 3 decades, he slowly added neighboring parcels whenever another rancher decided to retire, until the property stretched across 400 acres of rolling pasture, oak groves, hay fields, and 2 ponds that reflected the sunrise like polished glass every morning. My father used to joke that every fence post on the place had been set twice because Grandpa trusted hard work more than measurements. By the time I was old enough to carry a hammer, I knew every corner of that farm by heart. I could tell where the gravel became softer after a heavy rain, where the deer crossed the creek before dawn, and which pasture always turned green first after a dry Texas summer. Every Saturday started with the smell of fresh coffee drifting out of the farmhouse kitchen while Dad checked weather reports on a crackling radio older than I was. Then we climbed into his faded pickup, the tires crunching across the same gravel entrance those guards now claimed belonged to somebody else. That sound had always meant home to me. After my parents retired to a smaller place outside Fredericksburg, I stayed behind to keep the operation running. We leased part of the grazing land to neighboring ranchers, harvested coastal Bermuda hay every season, and maintained the property exactly the way my grandfather believed land should be treated, with patience instead of shortcuts. We never planned to sell because this place was worth more than money. It carried birthdays, family reunions, long afternoons repairing fences, and quiet evenings watching thunderstorms roll across the horizon without another house in sight. Everything changed about 6 years ago when construction crews appeared beyond our southern fence line. At first it seemed harmless. A few survey trucks, some bulldozers. Then hundreds of new homes began replacing open pasture. Streets appeared almost overnight. Decorative stone entrances, manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, walking trails, and eventually an entire subdivision filled with people who had no idea our family had been there for generations before the first foundation was ever poured. Most of the new neighbors were friendly enough. They waved when they drove past, and sometimes stopped to ask about the cattle or the old windmill. I welcomed them because good neighbors make rural life easier. But somewhere along the way, the leadership of that community stopped seeing our farm as a neighbor and started seeing it as an obstacle. Their newsletters began calling the gravel entrance a shared community corridor. New maps quietly colored portions of the surrounding area to make everything appear connected. Decorative signs crept closer to my fence every few months. I noticed each change, but I never imagined anyone would eventually station guards at the entrance and pretend decades of recorded ownership could disappear behind a freshly painted security gate. Looking back now, I realized none of those little changes had been accidents. They had been preparing the stage long before they ever tried to stop me from driving down my own road. The first time I met Diane Whitmore, she wore a bright white blazer that matched the luxury sport utility vehicle parked outside the newly finished clubhouse. She introduced herself with the polished smile of someone who had spent years convincing people that every decision she made was for their own good. "We are building the finest community in the county," she told me while extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I hope we can be wonderful neighbors." I believed her. I even welcomed the idea. A growing neighborhood meant better roads, stronger local businesses, and more families who appreciated the beauty of the Texas countryside. During those first months, everything seemed perfectly normal. Construction crews waved when they drove past the farm. Families stopped along the fence to admire the horses grazing in the south pasture. Children pointed excitedly whenever they spotted calves following their mothers through the fields. I answered questions, shared stories about the property, and never once complained about the temporary noise drifting across the hills. Then little things began changing. One weekend, I noticed decorative signs placed near the entrance to my gravel road with arrows directing visitors toward the subdivision amenities. They stood only a few feet away from my property line. I assumed it was an honest mistake and moved on. A month later, landscaping crews planted shrubs and stone borders closer to the entrance than before, making the road appear as though it belonged to the subdivision instead of the farm. Then came the neighborhood maps. A friendly resident showed me a brochure during an open house event. My gravel road had been colored the same shade as every private street inside the community. There was no mention that it served a family farm nearly half a century older than the subdivision itself. I contacted the management office and politely pointed out the error. They thanked me, promised to correct it, and assured me the printing company must have misunderstood the property lines. I accepted the explanation because I had no reason not to, but the mistakes never stopped. New residents began driving all the way down my road before realizing they had entered private agricultural property. Delivery trucks occasionally pulled into my equipment yard searching for homes that did not exist. One afternoon, I found temporary survey flags planted beside the gravel shoulder. They disappeared after I removed them, only to reappear several weeks later in slightly different locations. Each incident seemed too small to justify a legal dispute, yet together they painted a picture I did not fully understand at the time. The final change came quietly. A small security booth appeared near the subdivision entrance during the winter, advertised as an added convenience for homeowners. Then security patrol vehicles started driving past my gate several times each day. At first, the guards simply nodded as they passed. A few weeks later, they began slowing down to write notes on clipboards whenever my ranch hands hauled hay trailers through the entrance. Soon they started asking visitors where they were going before allowing them to continue. It was subtle enough that many people probably never questioned it, but I noticed every new layer of control settling over a road my grandfather had built with his own equipment decades before. Looking back, I realized Diane never intended to seize anything overnight. She understood that if you change a place one small step at a time, eventually people stop remembering how it looked before. By the time those guards told me I was not allowed to enter, they genuinely believed they were protecting property that had never belonged to the subdivision in the first place. The next morning, I returned before sunrise, hoping a calm conversation would accomplish more than an argument ever could. The air smelled like damp earth and fresh cedar after a light rain during the night. Fog drifted low across the pasture, softening the outlines of the fences my father and I had repaired countless times together. I parked beside the entrance, stepped out of my truck, and walked toward the security booth carrying nothing except my wallet, my truck keys, and a folder containing copies of my property records. The same two guards recognized me immediately. Their expressions stayed polite, but neither one reached for the chain stretched across the road. One of them asked for a resident access card. I explained again that I did not live inside the subdivision because I owned the farm beyond it. He listened without interrupting, then pointed toward a laminated sheet taped inside the booth. According to the instructions they had received, only authorized community residents and approved guests could continue beyond the checkpoint. I calmly asked who had written those instructions. The guard answered with the same confidence I had seen the day before. Diane Whitmore. I thanked him, climbed back into my truck, and drove directly to the clubhouse. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh paint and expensive coffee. Framed photographs of smiling families lined the walls beside awards celebrating community excellence. Diane greeted me as though nothing unusual had happened. She offered me a seat, folded her hands neatly across the conference table, and listened while I explained exactly what the guards had done. When I finished, she smiled with remarkable patience and slid a colorful neighborhood map across the table. Her finger traced the entrance road before stopping at a shaded section labeled Community Access Corridor. She spoke slowly, almost as if she expected me to appreciate the explanation. She said the road had become an essential part of neighborhood operations because emergency vehicles, contractors, landscaping crews, and utility companies all depended on it. Restricting access, she insisted, would create unnecessary confusion for everyone involved. I reminded her that convenience did not change ownership. She answered that perception often mattered just as much as paperwork. Those words stayed with me long after I left the building. Over the following weeks, the situation became even stranger. Ranch suppliers called to say security guards questioned every delivery before allowing trucks to continue. Friends visiting the farm phoned me from the entrance because they were being asked for identification. One local veterinarian arrived to check on a pregnant mare and was delayed while someone inside the booth searched through an approval list that did not include his name. Every inconvenience came wrapped in courteous language, yet each one quietly suggested that someone else now controlled access to property my family had managed for decades. I refused to lose my temper because I knew frustration was exactly what Diane expected. Instead, I documented everything. I saved emails, photographed every new sign, recorded dates and times, and kept notes after every conversation. The thicker my folder became, the more confident Diane appeared. She believed paperwork created by the subdivision would eventually outweigh paperwork filed long before the neighborhood even existed. Watching her confidence grow was almost fascinating. She had become so focused on controlling who could travel that single gravel road, she never stopped to consider why my grandfather had insisted on recording every easement, survey, and boundary map with the county all those years ago. Somewhere inside those forgotten records was a detail that neither Diane nor her security team had ever bothered to look for, and I had a feeling it was about to become the most valuable piece of paper either of us had ever seen. For the first time since all of this started, I wondered if I had underestimated just how far Diane was willing to push the illusion. I hired a local real estate attorney with an excellent reputation, handed him copies of my deed, tax records, and survey maps, and expected the entire misunderstanding to disappear within a week. Instead, he spent nearly an hour studying the documents before leaning back in his chair with a long sigh. He explained that ownership itself was not the problem. My title was clean. The boundaries were well documented. The challenge was that the subdivision had already established years of routine control over the entrance, and undoing that kind of practical arrangement could take months of hearings, engineering reviews, and county decisions. I left his office carrying the same folder I had walked in with, except now it felt twice as heavy. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off pickup trucks parked along the courthouse square, while the smell of barbecue drifted from a restaurant across the street. Normally, that little town always gave me a sense of comfort. That day it felt like everyone had accepted something that simply was not true. The following week the situation became even more frustrating. The security booth added another camera facing directly toward the farm entrance. Fresh signs appeared reminding visitors that all access required community authorization. Contractors delivering fencing supplies called me because they had been instructed to wait for approval before entering. One HOA customer canceled an order after sitting at the checkpoint for nearly 40 minutes. Even the feed supplier joked that I apparently needed permission from the neighborhood to run my own ranch. He laughed when he said it, but I did not. Every delay cost time, and every delay quietly strengthened the impression that the subdivision had legitimate authority over the road. Diane seemed to enjoy every minute of it. During one county planning meeting, she spoke confidently about preserving organized traffic flow and maintaining community safety. She never once claimed to own my farm. She did not have to. Instead, she carefully described the entrance as a shared operational corridor, repeating the phrase so often that several people in the room nodded without questioning where the description had originated. Watching that meeting taught me something important. She was not trying to steal the land itself. She was trying to redefine the story people believed about it. If enough residents, contractors, delivery drivers, and even county employees accepted her version long enough, the truth would slowly fade into the background. I drove home that evening just before sunset, parking beside the old equipment barn instead of fighting with the checkpoint again. The air carried the familiar scent of fresh-cut hay while swallows circled above the pasture exactly as they had since I was a child. I walked into the barn, running my hand across shelves my father had built decades earlier. Old coffee cans filled with bolts sat beside weathered toolboxes covered in dust. Rolled maps rested inside a wooden cabinet Grandpa had always kept locked, insisting that every important piece of paper deserved a safe place. I had searched through those cabinets many times over the years, but never with the feeling I carried that evening. Something told me the answer had never been sitting inside a courtroom or an argument with Diane. It had been waiting quietly on this farm the entire time, preserved by a man who believed that good records could protect a family long after the people who created them were gone. The lock on my grandfather's old filing cabinet clicked open with the same brass key that no longer fit the gate outside. The irony almost made me laugh. Dust drifted through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight as I lifted the heavy lid and found dozens of neatly labeled folders tied together with faded cotton string. Grandpa had never trusted memory when paper could tell the truth. Every land purchase, every tax receipt, every survey, every handshake that eventually became a legal document had been preserved with almost unbelievable care. The smell of aged paper and cedar filled the barn while I carefully spread the records across his old workbench. Most of the files contained exactly what I expected: property tax statements, livestock permits, fence agreements with neighboring ranches. Then I found a large survey tube tucked behind a cabinet. Inside was an original county engineering map dated 1972. The heavy paper crackled as I slowly unrolled it across the table. Every fence line matched the modern satellite maps almost perfectly, but one detail immediately caught my attention. The entrance road had been highlighted in red ink with a handwritten note signed by both my grandfather and the county surveyor. Attached behind the map was a recorded right-of-way agreement that I had never seen before. I read every line twice, then a third time just to make sure I was not imagining what was written there. The document granted neighboring landowners limited access across the private road only under one specific condition. The owner of the Walker farm would always retain unrestricted and exclusive control over the roadway itself. Any individual or organization that interfered with the owner's access immediately forfeited every temporary access privilege granted under the agreement. I stopped reading and simply stared at the page while the meaning slowly settled in. Diane had spent months treating the road as though her subdivision controlled it. Her security guards had physically prevented me, the legal owner, from using it. According to the recorded agreement filed with the county decades before the subdivision even existed, that single decision automatically terminated every permission allowing the neighborhood to use the road in the first place. Grandpa had anticipated this possibility more than 50 years ago. He had understood that ownership was one thing, but protecting future generations required language that left no room for interpretation. My heartbeat actually slowed instead of speeding up. For the first time since the guard stopped my truck, I was no longer frustrated. I was certain. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office carrying the original documents in protective sleeves. The clerk carefully compared the recording numbers against the official archive before smiling. Every page matched perfectly. Nothing had ever been revoked or amended. She even pointed me toward additional engineering records confirming that the roadway itself remained private property under the Walker family deed. I thanked her, requested certified copies of every relevant document, and walked back outside feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The courthouse clock chimed above the square while a warm Texas breeze carried the smell of fresh coffee from the cafe across the street. Diane believed she had been building authority one small step at a time. What she never realized was that every new sign, every checkpoint, every visitor she delayed, and every minute she blocked my access had quietly activated the very clause that stripped her community of the privilege she thought would last forever. I did not call Diane. I did not send a threatening letter. I did not post anything online. People who know they are standing on solid ground rarely need to raise their voices. Instead, I spent the next several days quietly assembling every piece of the puzzle. A licensed surveyor walked the entire length of the entrance road with equipment that looked more like something from a space mission than a ranch. Bright orange stakes appeared along the property line exactly where my grandfather's original survey had placed them more than 50 years earlier. Every measurement matched the recorded documents within a margin so small the surveyor actually smiled and said, "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing." I hired a land use attorney who specialized in easements instead of general real estate disputes. After reading the original agreement and the certified county records, she looked at me and said the words I had been waiting to hear. "You do not need to argue about ownership. You only need to enforce the agreement exactly as it was written." That single sentence changed everything. We prepared a formal legal notice explaining that unrestricted access for the property owner had been repeatedly denied by representatives acting on behalf of the subdivision. Because that condition had been violated, every temporary access privilege granted under the original right-of-way agreement had automatically terminated. Copies were delivered to the Homeowners Association, the County Transportation Office, the County Sheriff, Emergency Services, and every public utility that regularly used the road. Nobody received a surprise. Everyone received the same documents at the same time. Then I ordered a custom steel ranch gate from a fabricator who had worked with my family for years. He remembered helping my father repair cattle fencing when I was still in high school. When I explained where the new gate would be installed, he simply nodded and said, "I guess those old records finally came in handy." Watching the gate being unloaded onto the gravel felt strangely emotional. It was not about keeping people out. It was about restoring a boundary that should never have been ignored in the first place. The installation crew worked with quiet precision, while the morning air carried the familiar smell of cut cedar and diesel fuel from their equipment. They placed the gate several feet inside my recorded property line, exactly where the survey markers indicated. No inch was left to guesswork. Every bolt, hinge, and post matched the certified survey. Before sunset, reflective signs were mounted beside the entrance. They did not mention the subdivision or any personal dispute. They simply identified the roadway as private property and stated that access required written authorization from the owner. My attorney reviewed every word before the signs were installed. Even the county transportation inspector stopped by to verify that the gate complied with local regulations and did not interfere with any public roadway. By the end of the afternoon, everything was ready, but nothing had actually changed yet. The old security booth still stood farther down the entrance, and Diane still believed she controlled the road. She had no idea that every document had already been delivered, every survey had already been verified, and every legal requirement had already been satisfied. All that remained was the arrival of a single ordinary morning when hundreds of people would discover that the difference between control and ownership was not confidence. It was paperwork recorded decades before any of them had ever moved into the neighborhood. Monday arrived with a cool breeze carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and damp gravel across the entrance road. I parked my truck just inside the new gate shortly before sunrise and watched the sky slowly brighten over the oak trees. For a few peaceful minutes, nothing happened. Then the first resident drove toward the exit, slowed to a stop, and stared at the closed gate with a puzzled expression. Within 15 minutes, another vehicle arrived behind the first one. Then another. Delivery vans rolled in. Landscaping trailers lined up. A school bus approached from inside the subdivision before stopping several yards from the entrance. Nobody honked. Nobody shouted. Everyone simply looked around, trying to understand why the road they had driven across for years suddenly ended at a locked gate. My phone rang exactly at 7:30. Diane. I answered calmly. Her voice was measured at first, asking why the entrance had been closed and insisting there must have been some misunderstanding. I explained that there was no misunderstanding at all. The recorded right-of-way agreement had been terminated automatically the moment representatives of the homeowners association denied the property owner unrestricted access to his own road. I reminded her that certified copies of every supporting document had already been delivered several days earlier. Silence filled the line for several long seconds before she finally said that the neighborhood depended on this road. I answered with the same sentence my attorney had carefully prepared. Dependence does not create ownership. A few minutes later, county officials arrived exactly as scheduled. The transportation inspector reviewed the survey markers, compared them with the certified maps, and confirmed that the gate had been installed entirely on private property. A deputy from the sheriff's office stood nearby, not to remove anyone, but simply to ensure everyone remained calm while the documentation was reviewed. Even the security guards who had stopped me only days before looked uncomfortable as they watched officials compare recording numbers and boundary descriptions. They had simply followed instructions, and now those instructions were being measured against records older than the subdivision itself. By mid-morning, utility supervisors, emergency service representatives, and county planners had gathered near the entrance to discuss temporary alternatives while the legal situation was sorted out. Diane arrived carrying a thick binder filled with neighborhood documents, colorful maps, and internal policies. She confidently pointed toward the security booth, the landscaping, and years of routine use. My attorney quietly placed the original recorded agreement beside the county survey and asked one simple question. Can you show us any recorded amendment replacing this document? Diane turned pages for several minutes without finding an answer because there was none. The security booth, the signs, the access cards, and every internal policy had been created by the homeowners association, but none of them had changed the deed or the recorded agreement filed decades earlier. Around lunchtime, the county clerk confirmed the recording history once again over the phone, leaving no remaining uncertainty. Watching the expressions change around that entrance was remarkable. People were not witnessing a dramatic confrontation. They were watching paperwork quietly defeat assumptions. By the end of the afternoon, the subdivision board formally agreed to remove the checkpoint and begin negotiating a new legal access agreement. The road had never changed. The truth had simply caught up with everyone who had forgotten whose name had always been written on it. 3 weeks later, the entrance looked almost exactly the way I remembered it from childhood. The temporary security booth was gone. The decorative signs claiming community control had disappeared. Fresh gravel covered the sections where unnecessary barriers had once stood, and the only gate remaining was the one installed on my property, with the county survey resting behind every single measurement. I unlocked it every morning with the same brass key that had opened my grandfather's filing cabinet, and every time I heard the latch click into place, I thought about how strange it was that one forgotten document had protected our family across generations. The Homeowners Association eventually signed a completely new recorded access agreement. This time, every condition was written in plain language. The subdivision received limited access across the private road for residents, emergency vehicles, utility crews, and deliveries, but the ownership of the roadway remained exactly where it had always been, with the Walker family. Any future interference with the owner's unrestricted access would immediately suspend that privilege until the matter was resolved. There would be no confusion, no assumptions, and no room for creative interpretation. Diane attended the final county meeting with noticeably less confidence than the woman I had first met years earlier. She spoke professionally, acknowledged that mistakes had been made, and accepted the revised agreement without argument. A few months later, another resident was elected to lead the Homeowners Association. The new board introduced itself by visiting the farm in person. They shook my hand, asked thoughtful questions about maintaining good relations with neighboring landowners, and even volunteered to coordinate future road maintenance costs since their residents benefited from using the entrance every day. That conversation lasted less than an hour and accomplished more than years of unnecessary conflict. The farm itself never cared about any of the legal drama. The cattle still wandered through the same pastures. The windmill still creaked on breezy afternoons. The old oak trees continued dropping acorns onto the gravel every autumn, just as they had when my grandfather first drove his pickup across that road more than half a century ago. Sometimes I parked near the entrance at sunset and watched families from the subdivision drive home after work. Children laughed from the back seats. Dogs leaned happily out of open windows. Delivery trucks rolled by without stopping. The road finally served the purpose it was always meant to serve, connecting neighbors instead of dividing them. Looking back, I realized the biggest lesson had nothing to do with gates or legal agreements. It was about patience. I could have argued louder. I could have let frustration make every decision for me. Instead, I trusted the truth my grandfather had carefully recorded decades before I was old enough to understand why those papers mattered. Every survey marker, every map, every signature, and even that old brass key became part of the same story. They were never just objects. They were promises passed from one generation to the next. People often believe justice arrives with dramatic speeches or public victories, but that is rarely how real life works. Sometimes justice arrives inside a dusty filing cabinet, written in fading ink, waiting for the right person to remember where it was placed. My grandfather used to tell me that land remembers the people who respect it, and now I think he was right. The road never belonged to the loudest voice. It belonged to the name recorded on the deed, and in the end the truth did not need to shout because it had been patiently waiting there all along.